Welcome back to this series in which I build a very fancy robe. So the next order of business was deciding what kind of fabric I wanted to use, and I was really uninspired by a lot of what I had in stock. But then I remembered a couple of years ago I was going to go as a Winifred Sanderson for Halloween, and I had this glorious sort of like green fabric. And so I thought it over and I decided that it was time to sacrifice it for the good of the project, and so that was the fabric that I chose. So having chosen the fabric, now comes the exciting step of starting to make the garment. Now the first problem I ran into is that fabric has been different widths throughout time, and this particular fabric that I'm working with is a really wonky width. And in looking at the pattern, I realized that this pattern was specifically designed for narrower fabrics, because in the 40s, when this pattern was first printed, fabric was usually made at a much more narrow width than we have now. But I realized that my fabric was a little bit wider. It wasn't a standard like 54 inch, but it was wide enough to where I kind of said, you know, I'm just going to sort of risk it and see what happens, which I do not advise. So as you can see, I start setting out my pattern pieces, and I very quickly realized that I was going to have to get pretty wasteful with the material. You can also see that it was really slippery material, and this became a problem later on in that it just had a hell of a time trying to get it to like stay on the table. It was a whole thing. But anyway, so then I decided that what I wanted to do was make a contrasting lapel in gold fabric. And I had a couple of different gold options. I had this really nice sort of like creamy gold silk, and then I had a darker silk with sort of this weird repeating pattern. I wasn't a huge fan of the repeating pattern for the lapels, so what I did was I basically just sort of folded the material so I could cut around it and just get that really nice gold color without having to worry about the embroidery, because the embroidery is really weird. It's like half of an embroidery design. This fabric was like a remnant that I got on a really good clearance sale from my local fabric store, so I didn't mind sort of wasting it in order to get this piece cut out, because honestly it was like $5, so I don't really care. So I started cutting it out, and I figured out a way to get that pattern piece cut around that embroidery, and then I was pretty much good to go. Since the lapels were going to be of a contrasting fabric, I also realized that I was going to have to do the collar. And I ran into a lot of trouble with the collar on this project, especially in the sort of final stage of construction, but I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But right now you can watch me cut out the wrong size collar, because that is definitely a mistake that I made, which was not great. So from there, I just kept cutting out pattern pieces, which was okay. It went okay. This fabric was really, really frustrating to work with. I probably should have weighted it down, but at this point I was hangry and I just wanted to get the pieces cut out. So I got everything sort of lined up and set how I wanted, but it was really a struggle and I got really, really frustrated. It was also time to cut out the sleeves, which was a harrowing journey. So in cutting out the sleeves, I realized that I didn't actually have enough material long ways to cut the sleeve until I went back to the pattern and I remembered that one of the options on the pattern was a really cool sort of pointed 3/4 length sleeve. And that was part of the original style, and so I just went ahead and made the design call that to save a little bit of fabric and get that pattern piece to fit where I needed it on my fabric, I would just make it 3/4 sleeves. So I folded up the pattern and I shortened the sleeve, and then I was good to go. So one of the problems that I left for myself was that I hadn't actually adjusted the size of the arm sky in the new pattern with the adjusted bodice fit and everything. And so I kind of had an existential crisis about what I wanted to do, and did I want to bother with measuring all the angles and everything. And then because I'm lazy and this was just supposed to be a bathrobe and not like my wedding gown, I decided that I was just going to overdraw the pattern by about 2 inches, which in my mind I figured would give me enough extra sleeve to work with in order to fit it into the sort of adjusted armhole, but also not be as huge of a pain in the butt as finalizing an entirely redrafted sleeve. And it actually wound up working out pretty well. Some of that is absolutely dumb luck. But so you can see here I'm overdrawing the pattern, and yeah, it just made the sleeve a lot bigger than it was supposed to be, and it kind of worked out in my favor. But you know, if you want to make something a little bit more fancy or a little bit more, you know, up to designer code, you might want to spend some time redrafting your angles. I'm just lazy. So after I half-assed my way through the sleeves, it was time to half-ass my way through the skirt. And so the nice thing about the skirt is that you can see that it's just got this really great 1940s sweep to it. Even the pattern is just has this lovely drape to it. But the thing that I needed to fix was the fact that I extended the size of the bodice by about 2 inches, which also meant that I was going to need to extend the waistline of the skirt 2 inches so it didn't gap in the front. So this part of the process was really just my making sure that I knew which parts of the pattern went together. And then I just went ahead and I started resizing that skirt. Here I'm comparing it to the width of the bodice, just sort of checking and eyeballing where that skirt is supposed to fall in connection to the bodice. And what was really nice is I didn't have to actually add all that much. All I really had to do was account for that extra inch, but the problem was that the way that the skirt was laid out, it was just way too big for my fabric. So that's when we also got into the problem that there was this sort of natural weave to the fabric. And so I had to be really careful about how I was cutting my fabric, because otherwise one part of the garment was going to have this weave going one way and the other way was going to have like the weft going the other way. So then it became the great sliding island of fabric debacle of 2020, in which I didn't have a big enough table to lay out the fabric, but I didn't want to put it on the floor because we have a tiny little dog running around. So it just became this sort of like comedy of errors and trying to get this damn fabric to stay. But finally I pinned it all together and I got it relatively even, and then I also just kept reminding myself that this is a bathrobe, it's not my wedding gown, so honestly who cares if it's a little bit off. Let go and let God, I guess. It's fine. We're all fine, I promise. I also cannot stress how hangry I was at this moment. So the next thing I realized that because of the weave of the fabric, I was probably going to have to waste a huge amount of fabric to get both parts of the skirt with fabric going the same way. That was something that was really important to me, even though it's just dumb bathrobe. But I realized that if I sort of stacked the pattern pieces on top of each other, I would have just enough, like barely enough to get by. So I cut that first half of the skirt, and then I laid out the second, and you can see just how close I was to the end of the fabric. Like I made it by inches. I'm also kind of tall-ish. I'm like medium tall, but I realized that for this bathrobe to like drape elegantly to the ground, I was going to have to add a couple of extra inches, which was a huge bummer because that also ate up some of that extra fabric that I had. And so this just became a game of really trying to fit those pattern pieces together. And this really interesting shot of this corner of the fabric was on my phone for like 17 minutes, so I've shortened it just to say what I needed to say. So after realizing that I was an idiot and used the wrong size, unresized collar piece to cut out the piece of the collar, that's a sentence that made sense, I grabbed my resized pattern and I started cutting it out. Then I remembered, only after that I already cut out this piece, that I also still hadn't adjusted it back from last time when it was too long, so the collar just became this like huge mess and it was really stupid. But one of the things that I did decide was that I really liked the idea of having that little piece of embroidery sort of at the nape of the neck, just as sort of like a little fun detail. So I cut the collar around that embroidered detail and did the underneath of green just to sort of save on the nice fabric. And yeah, I cut it out and then it was on to the next phase. And so here is my beautiful pile of real official pattern pieces, and we're on to construction. Now, I decided to do something different for construction that I normally do, which is that in this particular pattern, there were a lot of steps that kind of jump around. Like you connect the sides of the bodice, but you don't connect the shoulders, and then you fold in the pleats and you sew the darts, but you don't sew the darts necessarily in the order that you would sort of think that you would. And so I decided, just sort of as a historical experiment, to try and follow directions as closely as I could, just to see if if anything about that process informed how the garment came together. Spoilers, it honestly didn't. It was kind of weird how this pattern was written because a lot of it is very counterintuitive and honestly wastes a lot of time. And so that was something that I struggled with, in knowing that it would be so much simpler just to like put the whole bodice together and then attach the skirt, but they didn't want you to do it that way. It was stuff like that that just like, I really didn't understand why they were telling me to do it that way, but I kept following the directions. And so here you can see that the first direction they tell you is to put in the pleats. If you watched episode 1 and 2, you know that I have struggled with these pleats since we started this project, but I've pretty much got them where I want them now, and so they're marked and they're pinned, and now I am sewing them together, and then we're on to the next step. So the next step is just doing those gathers at the top of the garment. Shut up, Alexa, nobody asked you. Alexa, I'm trying to record. It's very rude. Anyway, so after getting those instructions done, it was on to the next part, which is fussing around with the shoulders. And then I remembered how absolutely hangry I was, and so I took a grilled cheese break, and it was delicious. I keep talking about how hangry I was, but it is important to note that I really was. I don't know why. I just got in this like zone where I really wanted to get some progress done on this project. But I made a lot of really stupid mistakes just because I was literally very hungry and tired. And sometimes that's okay to acknowledge that you make a mistake. But one of the things that I did was, in cutting out the top part of the bodice, I accidentally drew all of the Sharpie marks on the front of the bodice and not the back side where they're supposed to go, which is, I just want to stress, about the most amateur hour move that you can possibly make. It was so stupid and I was so mad, but I decided that rather than waste a bunch more fabric, I would just sort of try and dart around the dots, and it honestly wound up working just fine. I just sort of hid the marks in the seam. But basically what I'm trying to say is that if you start a sewing project and you're hungry, stop and eat a sandwich first. Learn from my mistakes. So, sandwich in my tummy and darts and Sharpie marks covered, it was time to move on to the next step, which is setting the front of the collar, which is something that I was really looking forward to. So like I said earlier in the video, one of the things that I was really excited about was this idea of using that sort of really gorgeous gold fabric to do a contrasting lapel. Lapels are really challenging because you have to like get them in sort of just right, and you know, you have to pick the right kind of fabric so they don't like drape weird or fold weird or whatever. But I was really happy with this choice. But one of the things that I just kept running into was the fact that the green fabric just did not want to cooperate. It didn't want to take the darts. It didn't want to match up with the fabric. It kept stretching weird. And retroactively, I think I probably should have cut all of that green on the bias to prevent that sort of slipping around. But here we are, a week in the future, and, you know, it is what it is. So I set in the 2 collar pieces, and then it was time to jump over to the sewing machine and get them sewn. And like magic, we jumped to a shot of me sewing it on the machine, amid a pile of masks, because that's all I've been doing with my entire life. So then something really interesting started happening. You can kind of see a little bit if you look, but the machine, or the fabric, started gathering of its own volition. And this was a problem that I had never run into before. And it got to be kind of an issue. I kept messing around with like the tension and the bobbin and whatever. But what I eventually figured out was that I was using this like really cheap garbage polyester thread that I had bought off of Amazon. And that was also what I had my bobbin threaded with. And so to the best of what I can figure out, between the sort of slipperiness of the fabric and then also the slipperiness of the gross polyester thread on both the bobbin and the just, I don't, there's probably an official word for it, but the sewing part of the thread, it was not holding anything in place. And it was super frustrating because every time I sewed a line of fabric, I had to stop and like smooth it out and ungather it. And it just got to be such an issue that about midway through sewing all of this, I actually switched to a color of thread that just didn't match anything because I was just so tired of dealing with it, and that helped a lot. So that's sort of how I figured out what the thread problem was. But so anyway, so I got those collar pieces attached and flipped inside out, and then you can see that it's starting to like actually look like a real robe, or real collar, which is really super exciting. Even though it sort of looks like a weird 1940s Slytherin. I didn't realize that it was like kind of Slytherin-y until after I'd put it all together, and then I looked at it and I was like, shit. But it is what it is, and I like it, so it's fine. It's got like McGonagall vibes too, so I'm into it. It's whatever. Alright, so then we get to the great collar debacle of 2020, because basically, well, there's a lot that goes wrong here, so let's just watch it in action. So first, I unfold the collar piece that I cut out, and I realized that piece of embroidery, you can sort of see, has that like nice leaf shape, but I wanted it to be pointy on both ends. Like I wanted it to be like a mirror image of each other. So I went back to my fabric, and I was kind of looking at it and trying to figure out how to best sort of set in the fabric. And so I got that cut out, kind of. So I cut that out to try and match up the pattern. And that's what's happening. I should have sped this up more, but it's fine. You can just listen to my awkward pauses. Deal with it. So I marched sort of the point where I wanted the mirror image to begin and cut out the pattern that way, which is maybe not the best way to have done that, but whatever. And then I unfolded it only to realize that I had once again biffed it, and I left too little, either too much or too little, depending. So I cut a little bit off of the old collar, and then I matched up the pieces and I sewed them together. But again, that polyester thread was really killing me, and I could not get the embroidery to line up evenly. So it's kind of even. If you look at it really close, it's like off by like a ½ centimeter. But I decided it's a bathrobe. It's fine. Whatever. It's fine. We're all fine. I was so tired. So I also lined the fabric in that green, which was kind of good and kind of bad. Only because that green is it's so slippery. I should have cut it on the bias. Like, I should have just recut the whole damn thing, but I just didn't have enough time or fabric. So I was sort of dealing with it, but you can see even in, while I'm like working with it, it's just moving around, and it was really frustrating. And so I ironed it in and steamed it in as best I could. And then I marked the line for sewing with my iron, which is something that I really like to do on projects that require attention to detail, especially things like collars that can be tricky. I basically use the iron to create a crease, and that crease is sort of like the line that I follow on the machine while I'm sewing. And it honestly works really, really well, because then it just sort of becomes like you're tracing over the line. Rather than trying to like figure out where your machine needs to sew. But again, like the green fabric moved a good 1/4 of an inch after I'd done it, so I threw it, and I gave up. And then I started pinning it to the robe. I'll give you $1 if you can spot the problem with what I'm doing. I'll wait like 3 seconds for you to notice. So I realized that I was setting in the collar upside down because I'm dumb. I realized also that I could 100% just never admit that I make these mistakes. I could do that. That's a possibility. But I realized at some point that I love sewing. I love sewing. I love making stuff. I love building stuff. But nothing I make is ever perfect. You know, nothing I make is ever spot on or exactly correct. There's always something that I screw up or mess up or whatever. And I think particularly with things like YouTube and Instagram, where you've got all of these like amazing costumers and cosplayers and all of that stuff, you only ever see the finished product, and you only ever see the finished product from like 5 feet away, you know? And so there was just part of me that kind of realized that I wanted to kind of show that, you know what, even professionals do dumb stuff when they're tired and hungry and make silly mistakes. Like attaching the entire collar the wrong way, and I'm okay with that. I still haven't realized, by the way, at this point, I'm this far in, I still haven't realized that the collar is the wrong way. I don't know if I even realized it in this entire video, but I know that I realized it close enough. Is this where I realized? Maybe. I'm not sure. I could probably cut this and see, but I'm just in it for the journey now. Yeah, so I got the collar set. Hold on, I'm gonna check. Smash cut. Okay. So then, this is the moment. You can see it. You can see it in my hand. This is the moment where I realize that I have set the collar in backwards. So I have to start all over, but this time, you know, at least it's right. That's good and exciting. So I get that collar set in, and then it is time to sew it. So having corrected the direction of my collar and I trimmed about 1 inch off of both ends to compensate for that missized pattern. So I sew the back of the collar to the back of the bathrobe. And then I realized that in the transition between mock-up to resized again to embroidered to corrected embroidered piece, I realized that somewhere along the line, the marking of where the collar is supposed to stop got lost. It got left off or buried or sewn over or something. I'm honestly not sure. But you can see I'm still really struggling with that polyester thread as well. So basically what I decided to do is, rather than wind up with like a wonky short collar or a wonky long collar, I basically left the ends of the collar open and only attached it on the one side, and then that way I could try it on, see how it looked, and then pin the pieces of the collar to the place that I liked. And I'm really happy that I did it this way, because I wound up being close, but it did require about like 1.5 inch adjustment to really get it to where I liked the look of it.
So then it was time for the sleeves. One of the things that I knew right across the bat was that the top of the sleeves were going to need to be gathered. Thankfully, that crappy polyester thread totally worked in my favor, and I got this really beautiful gather just by the sheer virtue of how crappy the thread was, completely on accident, which was sort of wonderful. So that was cool. That was cool that I got to use that to work in my favor. So then I just sort of sewed down the lengths of the sleeve, and you can see that it's just so bad. That gather is so bad. And it got to the point where I was having to cut like extra thread to stretch the flattened fabric onto. It was a nightmare. This sewing with that awful thread, honestly, it took hours longer just because I kept having to go back and correct. But like I said, at the top you can watch that really nice gather happen, which is pretty cool. Yeah, and then just did the same thing for the second sleeve, matched it, sewed down the length of it, and then it was time to insert the sleeves into the robe and see if my half-assed mathematical wizardry had all been worth it. Spoilers, honestly, these sleeves went in pretty well and without, honestly, much hassle at all. I set my sleeves differently than a lot of people. I think my sort of sleeve setting technique is maybe a little bit more like based in theatrical sewing. I also realized that there were a couple of places where, because the thread was so slippery and not holding, it was coming undone and sliding out. So I had to make a couple corrections along the way. Again, it was so frustrating. It was so frustrating to want to get stuff done on this project and constantly have to worry about it. You can see, so basically the way that I set my sleeves in is I turn the garment inside out, but I keep the sleeves right side out. So you're basically looking at your garment through the sleeve hole, as though you're about to put your arm into it, which is honestly really practical. It's really practical and it's really useful. And then that way you don't wind up like with one sleeve turned inside out or something like that, and you're just putting right sides against right sides and sewing them together. But it does take a little bit more pinning, just because you want to be like absolutely certain that everything is exactly where you want it before you sew. So with this horrendous camera angle, I don't know what's happening. I got all of that done and set, and then it was time to sew them in. It's honestly not like super exciting. I just, sewed them in, got them set the way that I wanted. And then it was time to start putting the skirt together. The skirt, honestly, I sped this up a million times because it was just so boring. It was just a lot of straight lines, and just getting the skirt sort of attached together and then attaching it to the bodice. I guess there's like a lot of fuzz on my elbow that day. I don't know. And yeah, so I mean, the nice thing about the skirt was because I had only resized the bodice by a couple of inches, the skirt came together really simply. Yeah, it's a skirt. You've sewn one, you've sewn them all. It's a bunch of triangles. So after getting the skirt all sewn together, the next step was getting it attached to the bodice. And one of the things that I left until sort of this moment was cutting out a couple of the tie straps. They are part of the original pattern, but spoilers, they're a rectangle, so I just decided to use some scrap that I had laying around instead of taking the time to like meticulously cut out another rectangle. So I created that little belt strap, and I needed to actually do a couple of more of these, but I decided to wait until I had tried it on to make sure that I liked the placement of the first one, because the placement of the first one informs the placement of like the second and the third one. So I decided just to do the one and to decide if I liked it, and so I did that. And that polyester thread was about to be the death of me, and so I decided to take a break. Having regained my composure, it was now time to attach the strap. And like I said, the placement of this one is going to inform the placement of like the second one. So it was really more of sort of an experimental thing, but I got it placed kind of how I like it. Another thing that I think is worth commenting on as I sort of work on this is that we as a modern society are very used to garments that have exceptionally finished insides, garments that look pristine and perfect on the inside. But in actuality, if you look at a lot of historical garments, while care was taken to make sure that, seams were finished and that kind of thing, there isn't that sort of consummate professionalism in the inside. And so one of the things that I find very odd about this pattern is that the pattern is not actually lined. It is not designed to be lined. So you've got all of these sort of like exposed edges and seams and places where you top stitch, and you can very obviously see how things are made. And so that's something that I've been kind of struggling with in putting this project together, because on one hand, I want it to, look really cool and really nice. But on the other hand, it's a bathrobe. Who cares what the inside seams look like, And so it's been kind of fun and interesting thinking about how garments were constructed when the focus wasn't necessarily on, factory quality finishing, but more of, well, nobody's going to see the inside, so who cares what the inside of your bathrobe looks like? I just think that's kind of a cool historical thing that a lot of historical folks, I think, were a little bit more practical than us in some of those ways, and assuredly a lot less wasteful. So before I was ready to try it on, I decided I wanted to do a little bit more futzing with the collar. And so this is where I decided to really take the time and try and get the length of the collar set. And you can see that embroidery is kind of matched up unless you look really, really close. But I was happy with it, and I like that it's like just kind of a fun, cute little luxurious detail on the back of my luxurious fancy robe. So it wound up being okay, but I sewed it down a little bit more, and I got the edges finished to where I wanted. But the inside of that collar is going to have to get hand tacked down. But again, I am terrible at hand sewing, and so I only wanted to do it once. So I decided to wait until I have everything tried on to make sure that I'm happy with the fit before I commit to hours and hours and hours of hand sewing, because I'm terrified of hand sewing. I'm terrible at it. So then the moment of truth arrived, and I was really nervous. I really didn't know if this was going to fit or if it was going to look terrible. But then all of a sudden I had kind of a badass robe. And so there's a couple of issues with the fit that I wasn't super thrilled about. Like it's weirdly like boxy up at the top. But then something amazing happened. I discovered Hollywood on Netflix. And in Hollywood, it's basically a show about Patti LuPone looking fabulous in a bunch of bathrobes that are all honestly my robe is from that time period. And so stylistically, there were a lot of similarities in the robes that Patti LuPone wears and in the one that I was making. But there was one big difference that I actually realized that I think will be a major improvement. And so the next part of this video is where I take a major departure from the original pattern that I bought, and I sort of MacGyver together a fabulous Patti LuPone musical theater robe. Stay tuned.